Case 1. Megan Huntsman, the House of Horrors. On a cold April afternoon in 2014, a man made a discovery in his Pleasant Grove home that would send shockwaves across the entire nation. Inside cardboard boxes in the garage, wrapped in plastic bags and towels, he found the remains of 7 infants. 7 tiny bodies. 7 lives extinguished before they could even begin. The man was cleaning out the garage of the home he'd once shared with his ex-wife, Megan Huntsman. What he discovered that day would reveal a decade-long secret that nobody could have imagined, even in their darkest nightmares. Pleasant Grove, Utah, is the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where kids play in front yards until the streetlights come on, where families gather for barbecues on summer evenings. It's a community built on trust, on the Mormon values of family and faith that define so much of Utah culture. It was in this wholesome setting that Megan Huntsman committed one of the most prolific serial killings in Utah history. Between 1996 and 2006, Megan Huntsman gave birth to at least 7 babies. She told no one. She showed no one. When each infant was born, she strangled or suffocated them, wrapped their tiny bodies in plastic bags or towels, placed them in cardboard boxes, and stored them in the garage like discarded belongings. For 10 years, she carried this secret. For 10 years, she walked past those boxes. For 10 years, nobody knew. When investigators first arrived at the home on the 1800 block of West Porter Lane, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Pleasant Grove Police Captain Mike Roberts later told reporters that in his 30 years of law enforcement, he'd never encountered anything like this. The initial call came in as a possible stillbirth, but as detectives processed the scene, the true scope of the horror became clear. DNA testing confirmed that Megan Huntsman was the biological mother of all 7 infants. Further testing revealed that 6 of the babies had been born alive. They had drawn breath. Their hearts had beaten. They had existed in this world, however briefly, before their own mother took their lives. Medical examiners determined the babies were born at or near full term, between the years 1996 and 2006. The house on Porter Lane became a crime scene unlike any Utah had witnessed before. Investigators worked methodically, documenting everything, treating each tiny victim with the dignity they'd been denied in life. The community of Pleasant Grove reeled in shock. How could this happen here? How could nobody know? Megan Huntsman's daughters, the children she'd allowed to live, never knew they had siblings hidden in the garage. Her husband, who was incarcerated on drug charges during much of the time period when the murders occurred, was not considered a suspect. The baby's father was determined to be Huntsman's estranged husband, but DNA evidence cleared him of any wrongdoing in the deaths. He had known nothing about the pregnancies, the births, or the murders. Investigators pieced together a chilling timeline. Huntsman would become pregnant, hide her condition, give birth alone, kill the infant, and hide the body. Then she would simply continue with her life as though nothing had happened. She attended family gatherings. She raised her living children. She went about her daily routines, all while 7 bodies decomposed in boxes just steps away. Psychiatrists and psychologists struggled to explain Huntsman's actions. Dr. Paul Mones, a Portland-based attorney who has studied maternal filicide, noted that cases of neonaticide, the killing of infants within 24 hours of birth, often involve young, isolated women who deny their pregnancies. But Huntsman's case was different. She was an adult woman with other children. She wasn't a frightened teenager. She had access to resources. Yet she chose, again and again, to kill. When Pleasant Grove police arrested Megan Huntsman on April 13, 2014, she initially gave investigators conflicting statements. But eventually, she admitted to killing 6 of the 7 babies. She claimed one had been stillborn. She said she'd been addicted to methamphetamine during this period, using drugs to cope with the stress of her life, though toxicology could not be performed on the remains due to their condition. The question everyone asked was simple but profound. Why? Why kill these babies? Why not give them up for adoption? Utah has safe haven laws. She could have left them at a hospital, a fire station, a church. No questions asked. No charges filed. But instead, she chose murder. Huntsman's explanation, when it finally came, was almost incomprehensible in its banality. She told investigators she didn't want the babies. She didn't want to deal with them. So she killed them. It was that simple, that cold, that devoid of maternal instinct or human compassion. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Megan Huntsman was charged with 6 counts of murder, 1 for each baby proven to have been born alive. Prosecutors initially considered pursuing the death penalty, but ultimately decided against it. In April 2015, exactly 1 year after the discovery of the bodies, Huntsman pleaded guilty to all 6 counts of murder. At her sentencing hearing, Utah County Prosecutor Spencer Walsh described the crime as a horrible tragedy that defied understanding. He noted that Huntsman had showed no signs of mental illness that would explain her actions. She had simply made a choice, again and again, to kill. Judge Darrell McDade sentenced Megan Huntsman to serve 6 consecutive terms of 15 years to life in prison, meaning she would spend at least 90 years behind bars before being eligible for parole. Given that she was 39 years old at sentencing, it was effectively a life sentence. Pleasant Grove Police Captain Roberts spoke to reporters after the sentencing, his voice heavy with emotion. "In my career, I've seen a lot of terrible things," he said. "But this case will haunt me forever. 7 innocent lives, taken by the one person who should have protected them most." The home on West Porter Lane where the bodies were discovered became a source of painful curiosity. Real estate records show it changed hands in the years following the discovery, though selling a home with such a dark history proved challenging. Neighbors reported that even years later, they couldn't pass the house without thinking about what happened there, about the babies whose only home was cardboard boxes in a garage. Megan Huntsman's living daughters have never spoken publicly about their mother's crimes. One can only imagine the psychological burden they carry, knowing that they survived while their siblings did not, that some arbitrary decision in their mother's mind determined who lived and who died. The case raised troubling questions about how such crimes can go undetected for so long. Huntsman was pregnant at least 7 times over a 10-year period. How did nobody notice? The answer, investigators concluded, was that Huntsman had become skilled at hiding her pregnancies, wearing loose clothing, avoiding situations where her condition might be noticed. She gave birth alone, without medical assistance, demonstrating a level of planning and premeditation that made her crimes even more disturbing. Today, Megan Huntsman sits in the Utah State Prison, where she will likely spend the rest of her life. The babies she killed were never given names, never held by loving arms, never had a chance to experience the world. They exist now only as case numbers, as evidence in a file, as a cautionary tale about the depths of human depravity. The Megan Huntsman case remains one of the most shocking crimes in Utah history, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with drama or obvious signs. Sometimes it wears the face of a mother, living in a quiet neighborhood, hiding unthinkable secrets behind a normal facade. If this case affected you, if you're thinking about the 7 innocent lives lost, hit that like button. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you never miss our deep dives into cases that demand to be remembered. These victims deserve our attention, our horror, and our commitment to never forget. Case 2. Ruby Franke, the YouTube MOM who fooled millions. For years, the Franke family was YouTube royalty. Their channel, 8 Passengers, showcased what appeared to be an idyllic Mormon family life in Springville, Utah. Ruby Franke, a mother of 6, presented herself as a parenting expert, someone who had all the answers when it came to raising obedient, successful children. Millions of subscribers tuned in to watch the Franke children navigate homework, chores, and family activities. The comments sections overflowed with praise for Ruby's strict, but supposedly loving approach to parenting. But behind the camera, behind the carefully curated videos and cheerful thumbnails, Ruby Franke was systematically abusing her children in ways that would eventually shock even the most hardened law enforcement officers. The truth began to emerge on the morning of August 30th, 2023, when a 12-year-old boy, emaciated and covered in wounds, climbed out of a window in Ivins, Utah, and ran to a neighbor's house begging for food and water. The neighbor, who would later describe the child as looking like a concentration camp survivor, immediately called 911. When police arrived at the home in the Santa Clara area, what they discovered launched an investigation that would expose one of the most disturbing child abuse cases in Utah history. The boy had duct tape around his ankles and wrists. His body showed evidence of severe malnourishment. He was covered in cuts, bruises, and open wounds. He looked, according to one officer, like he'd been tortured. The home belonged to Jody Hildebrandt, Ruby Franke's business partner and the woman behind a controversial counseling service called Connections. Ruby Franke had moved in with Hildebrandt months earlier, bringing some of her children with her. What happened in that house over the following months would later be described by prosecutors as systematic torture masked as religious discipline. When officers entered the home, they found Ruby Franke's 10-year-old daughter in a similar condition to her brother. Both children were severely malnourished, showing signs of prolonged abuse. They were immediately taken to a hospital, where doctors documented injuries consistent with long-term physical abuse, neglect, and psychological torture. Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt were arrested on the spot, both charged with 6 counts of aggravated child abuse. As news of the arrest spread, the internet exploded. Former subscribers of 8 Passengers, many of whom had expressed concern about Ruby's parenting methods for years, felt vindicated in their worries. But nobody had imagined the abuse was this severe. The investigation revealed a horrifying pattern of cruelty. Ruby Franke, under the influence of Jody Hildebrandt's twisted interpretation of religious principles and therapy, had subjected her children to starvation, forced labor, isolation, and physical punishment that crossed every line into criminal abuse. The children were told they were possessed by demons, that they were evil, that the abuse was necessary for their salvation. Ruby's 12-year-old son had been forced to do physical labor outdoors in the Utah summer heat, without adequate food or water. When he made mistakes or failed to complete tasks to Ruby's satisfaction, he was bound with rope, his wounds treated with cayenne pepper and honey rather than proper medical care. He was told he was evil, that he deserved his suffering, that this was all for his own good. His younger sister suffered similarly. Both children lived in constant fear, isolated from the outside world, cut off from their father and older siblings, trapped in what prosecutors would later describe as a concentration camp-like setting. The question on everyone's mind was, how did it come to this? Ruby Franke had once been a popular parenting vlogger with millions of followers. What transformed her from a strict but seemingly functional mother into a woman capable of torturing her own children? The answer lay partly in her relationship with Jody Hildebrandt. Hildebrandt, a licensed therapist who had faced prior complaints about her methods, ran Connections, a counseling service that blended religious fundamentalism with pop psychology. She claimed to help families by identifying distortions in their thinking, particularly in children. Her methods were controversial, her success dubious, but she attracted clients drawn to her certainty and her religious rhetoric. Ruby Franke met Hildebrandt in 2022, and the relationship quickly became all-consuming. Ruby began promoting Hildebrandt's services on social media. She started adopting Hildebrandt's language about distortions and accountability. She became increasingly isolated from family members who questioned her new approach. Eventually, she moved in with Hildebrandt, bringing some of her children with her. Former 8 Passengers subscribers had raised red flags about Ruby's parenting long before the arrest. Videos showed Ruby refusing to bring her 6-year-old daughter lunch at school as punishment for forgetting it at home. Another video featured Ruby explaining that she'd canceled Christmas for her children as discipline. Viewers reported the channel to authorities multiple times, but the complaints never resulted in action that could have prevented the escalating abuse. Ruby's husband, Kevin Franke, became estranged from his wife in the months before her arrest. In May 2023, he moved out, later filing for divorce. He would later claim he'd been kept from his children by Ruby and Jody, that he'd been manipulated and deceived about their well-being. Critics questioned how he could have been unaware of the abuse, but prosecutors ultimately did not charge him with any crimes. As the legal case moved forward, disturbing details continued to emerge. Ruby's journal entries, seized by police, revealed the depth of her delusion. She wrote about her children as though they were possessed, describing their supposed evil in clinical detail. She documented the punishments she inflicted, framing them as necessary interventions. The journals read like something from a horror movie, a parent's love so twisted by ideology that it became indistinguishable from sadism. On December 18, 2023, Ruby Franke pleaded guilty to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. In her plea agreement, she admitted to torturing her children, though she attempted to shift much of the blame to Jodi Hildebrandt, claiming she'd been manipulated by her business partner. Prosecutors rejected this narrative, making clear that Ruby Franke was a willing and active participant in the abuse. Jodi Hildebrandt also pleaded guilty to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. Both women faced maximum sentences of 15 years for each count. At her sentencing hearing in February 2024, Ruby Franke finally faced her victims. Her children, now in the care of family members and foster services, had provided impact statements describing the hell they'd endured. Ruby's 12-year-old son wrote about being tied up, starved, and told he was evil. He wrote about believing he deserved the abuse because his mother said so. He wrote about the day he found the courage to escape, how he'd been terrified Ruby would find him and drag him back. Judge John Walton didn't mince words. He described Ruby Franke's crimes as some of the worst child abuse he'd encountered in his career. He noted that she'd had every advantage, every resource, every opportunity to seek help or change course. Instead, she'd chosen to torture her children. Ruby Franke was sentenced to 4 consecutive terms of 1 to 15 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under Utah law. The exact number of years she'll serve will be determined by the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole, but she'll spend at least 4 years behind bars, and potentially up to 60 years if the board orders the terms served consecutively to their maximum. Jodi Hildebrandt received the same sentence. Both women were taken immediately into custody, their brief apologies at sentencing doing nothing to mitigate the horror of their crimes. The Ruby Franke case sent shockwaves through the parenting influencer community. Other YouTube family channels faced increased scrutiny. Questions were raised about the ethics of monetizing children's lives, about the lack of oversight for family vloggers, about the danger of presenting curated perfection while abuse happens off camera. Ruby's older children, now adults, spoke out about their experiences growing up in the Franke household. They described a childhood marked by strict rules, harsh punishments, and emotional manipulation, though they were clear that the abuse had escalated dramatically in Ruby's final years of freedom. They expressed gratitude that their younger siblings had been rescued when they were, horror at what might have happened if that 12-year-old boy hadn't found the courage to escape. The 8 Passengers YouTube channel was permanently deleted. Ruby's social media presence vanished. The carefully constructed image of the perfect Mormon family shattered completely, revealing the nightmare underneath. Today, Ruby Franke's younger children are in therapy, working to recover from years of abuse. Experts say their road to healing will be long and difficult. They'll carry the physical and psychological scars of their mother's cruelty for the rest of their lives. But they're safe now. They're in environments where they're told they're loved, not evil. Where mistakes lead to teaching moments, not torture. Where the adults in their lives protect them instead of harming them. The Ruby Franke case is a stark reminder that monsters don't always lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they smile for the camera, rack up millions of views, and call their cruelty love. Sometimes they hide behind religion, behind therapy jargon, behind the facade of parenting expertise. And sometimes, despite warning signs visible to thousands of strangers online, they get away with it until a brave child says enough. If this case made you think about the children behind the family vlogs you watch, if you're grateful that Ruby's children finally got the protection they deserved, show your support by hitting that like button. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour and ring that notification bell so you never miss when we shine light on cases the world needs to understand. Justice was served, but we must never forget what happened behind that camera. Case 3. Nicole Leah Scott, the stepmother's deadly secret. Blended families face unique challenges. Step-parents must earn trust, build relationships, navigate complicated dynamics between biological parents and new family structures. Most do so with patience, love, and genuine care for the children who become part of their lives. But on July 9, 2024, in a home in West Jordan, Utah, a stepmother's failure to protect a vulnerable child ended in tragedy that shook the community to its core. Gavin Peterson was only 8 years old when his life ended. He should have been playing video games, riding his bike, counting down the days until summer ended and 3rd grade began. Instead, he died from injuries that medical examiners would later describe as extensive, severe, and entirely preventable. The person responsible for his death was the woman who should have been protecting him, his stepmother, Nicole Leah Scott. The call came in to West Jordan Police on that July afternoon. A child was unresponsive. First responders rushed to the home, but when they arrived, they knew immediately that Gavin was beyond saving. His small body showed signs of trauma that couldn't be explained away as an accident. This wasn't a fall, wasn't a tragic mishap. This was abuse, prolonged and severe, that had finally proved fatal. Nicole Scott's story to police didn't add up. She claimed Gavin had been injured in an accident, but the evidence told a different story. Medical examiners found bruising, injuries in various stages of healing, signs of malnutrition and neglect. Gavin hadn't died from a single incident. He died from sustained abuse that had escalated over time until his small body simply couldn't survive any longer. Detectives launched an investigation that would reveal a pattern of abuse hidden behind closed doors. Gavin's biological mother didn't have custody. She'd been deemed unfit by the courts, a decision that in retrospect would haunt everyone involved. Gavin had been placed with his father and stepmother, the assumption being that they would provide a stable, loving home. Nobody realized that removing Gavin from one harmful situation had placed him directly into another. Neighbors told investigators they'd occasionally heard yelling from the Scott home, but nothing that seemed exceptional for a household with children. The abuse happened behind walls, away from witnesses who might have intervened. Gavin went to school, where teachers later reported he'd seemed withdrawn and occasionally had unexplained bruises, but Child Protective Services had investigated and closed the case. The system that should have saved Gavin had failed him repeatedly. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered disturbing text messages between Nicole Scott and Gavin's father. The messages revealed that Scott had been abusing Gavin for months, possibly longer. She complained about his behavior, described him using dehumanizing language, detailed punishments that crossed the line from discipline into abuse. Gavin's father, according to the messages, was aware of at least some of the mistreatment but failed to protect his son. The question of why haunted investigators. Why would a stepmother abuse a child in her care? Psychologists who reviewed the case noted that while most blended families successfully navigate their challenges, some step-parents harbor resentment towards stepchildren, viewing them as burdens or obstacles to their relationship with their partner. In extreme cases, this resentment can turn violent. Nicole Scott was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and child abuse homicide. Prosecutors alleged that her abuse of Gavin had been systematic and intentional, culminating in his death on July 9th. She pleaded not guilty, her defense attorneys arguing that she'd been overwhelmed and that Gavin's death was a tragic accident rather than intentional murder. But the evidence was damning. Medical examiners testified about the severity of Gavin's injuries, about the pattern of abuse visible on his body. Child welfare workers testified about missed opportunities to intervene. Teachers described a boy who'd grown increasingly quiet and sad over the months before his death. Every piece of evidence painted the same picture. Gavin had been suffering, and the adults around him had failed to save him. The trial, scheduled for 2025, would force West Jordan to confront uncomfortable questions about how child abuse goes undetected, about the limitations of Child Protective Services, about the assumptions made when children are placed with family members deemed safe. Gavin's biological mother, despite her own troubled history, spoke out about her son's death. She told reporters that Gavin had been her sweet boy, that despite her own failures as a parent, she'd never wanted this for him. She expressed regret that the court system had removed Gavin from her care only to place him somewhere worse. Her statement was complicated, painful, and honest in its acknowledgement that Gavin had been failed by every adult in his life, including her. The Scott case highlighted the particular vulnerabilities of children in blended families, especially when one biological parent is absent or deemed unfit. Gavin had no advocate, no adult who was truly in his corner. His father, who should have protected him, instead enabled his abuse. His mother was out of the picture. His stepmother, who bore the primary responsibility for his care, became his killer. West Jordan community members held vigils for Gavin, releasing balloons and sharing memories of a little boy who'd been quiet but kind, who'd loved dinosaurs and drawing, who deserved so much better than the brief, painful life he'd been given. His second-grade teacher wept as she described Gavin's smile, how he'd light up when praised, how he'd seemed hungry for affection and approval. The home where Gavin died became a grim landmark in the neighborhood. Parents walking their children to school would see it and hold their kids a little tighter, grateful their own children were safe, heartbroken that Gavin hadn't been. As of this recording, Nicole Leah Scott's trial is still pending. She remains in custody, held without bail, awaiting her day in court. Prosecutors are seeking a lengthy prison sentence, arguing that her abuse of Gavin was premeditated and cruel. The defense continues to maintain that Scott was overwhelmed and that Gavin's death, while tragic, wasn't murder. But for those who knew Gavin, for the community that mourned him, the legal distinctions matter less than the fundamental truth. An 8-year-old boy died because the woman charged with protecting him chose to hurt him instead. Whether the court calls it murder or manslaughter or abuse homicide, the result is the same. Gavin is gone, and Nicole Scott is responsible. The case remains open, moving slowly through the Utah court system. Justice for Gavin is coming, though it will never be enough to compensate for the life he lost, the future he was denied, the suffering he endured in his final months. If Gavin's story broke your heart, if you're thinking about the children suffering in silence right now, hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We tell these stories because these children deserve to be remembered, because awareness can prevent the next tragedy, because justice delayed shouldn't mean justice forgotten. Stay with us as we continue to follow cases that demand our attention. Case 4. Reyna Elizabeth Flores-Rosales, a mother's fatal rage. The morning of February 25, 2019, started like any other in a quiet Salt Lake City neighborhood. Children were getting ready for school, adults were preparing for work, the rhythms of daily life were unfolding in homes up and down the street. But in one house, something terrible was happening behind closed doors, something that would end with a 6-year-old boy fighting for his life. Norland Cruz was his name. He was small for his age, with dark hair and an infectious laugh that neighbors remembered fondly. He loved superheroes and cartoons, spent hours playing with toy cars, dreamed of becoming a firefighter when he grew up. He should have been in first grade that February morning, learning to read and making friends. Instead, he was dying. When paramedics arrived at the home in response to a frantic 911 call, they found Norland unresponsive. His mother, Reyna Elizabeth Flores-Rosales, told first responders that Norland had fallen and hit his head. But as paramedics worked to stabilize the boy, they noticed injuries inconsistent with a simple fall. There was bruising, evidence of trauma, signs that pointed to something far more sinister than an accident. Norland was rushed to Primary Children's Hospital, where doctors fought to save his life. But the injuries were too severe. Norland's small body had endured trauma it couldn't recover from. Despite the best efforts of medical staff, Norland died at the hospital, never regaining consciousness, never getting the chance to tell anyone what had happened to him. The medical examiner's report revealed the horrifying truth. Norland hadn't died from a fall. He died from blunt force trauma to his abdomen, injuries severe enough to cause internal bleeding and organ damage. Someone had hurt this little boy badly enough to kill him, and that someone was his mother. As detectives investigated, they uncovered a pattern of abuse in the Flores-Rosales home. Norland's siblings, when interviewed by child welfare workers in a safe environment, described a household where physical punishment was severe and frequent. They said their mother had a temper, that she would lash out when angry, that Norland had been a particular target of her rage. Child Protective Services had been to the home before. There had been reports, investigations, case files documenting concerns about the children's welfare. But each time, the case had been closed without removal of the children. The abuse had been deemed insufficient to warrant taking the kids from their mother. The system had assessed the risk and decided Norland was safer at home than in foster care. That decision proved fatal. Reyna Flores-Rosales was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and child abuse homicide. Prosecutors alleged that she'd beaten Norland to death in a fit of rage on that February morning, then concocted the story about a fall to cover her crime. She pleaded not guilty, her defense attorneys arguing that Norland's death had been accidental, that any injuries had resulted from discipline that had gone too far rather than intentional murder. But the evidence suggested otherwise. The severity of Norland's injuries indicated extreme force. Medical experts testified that the damage to Norland's internal organs couldn't have resulted from normal discipline or even a severe spanking. Someone had hit Norland with tremendous force, repeatedly, in a way that could only be described as an attack. The trial revealed more disturbing details. Norland's siblings testified about witnessing their brother's abuse, about being too scared to intervene, about knowing that speaking up might result in them becoming targets too. They described Norland as sweet and gentle, someone who cried easily, who seemed to absorb his mother's anger like a sponge. They said he'd been sick the day he died, that he'd been complaining of stomach pain, that their mother had been frustrated with him for not getting ready for school fast enough. That frustration, prosecutors argued, had turned deadly. Reyna Flores-Rosales had lost control, had beaten her 6-year-old son so severely that he died. Then she'd called 911 and lied about what happened, hoping to avoid responsibility for her crime. The jury didn't buy her story. In a trial that lasted several weeks, they heard testimony from medical examiners, from child welfare workers, from Norland's siblings, from neighbors who'd heard raised voices and crying children. The picture that emerged was of a mother who'd used physical punishment as her primary parenting tool, who'd seen her children as sources of frustration rather than individuals deserving of love and protection. Reyna Flores-Rosales was convicted of child abuse homicide, though the jury deadlocked on the first-degree murder charge. The distinction was significant from a legal perspective, but changed nothing for Norland. He was still gone, his future erased by his mother's violence. At sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. He described Flores-Rosales as someone who'd betrayed the most fundamental duty of parenthood. He noted that she'd had numerous opportunities to seek help, to change her parenting methods, to protect her son. Instead, she'd escalated her abuse until it killed him. Reyna Flores-Rosales was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. She'll be eligible for parole after 15 years, though there's no guarantee she'll be released. The parole board will have to weigh whether she's been rehabilitated, whether she poses a continued danger, whether justice for Norland demands she serve the full life sentence. Norland's siblings were placed in foster care, then eventually with relatives who could provide a safe, stable environment. They carry the trauma of witnessing their brother's death, of living in a home where violence was normalized, of losing both their brother and their mother in a single terrible day. Therapists working with them say the road to recovery will be long, that the scars of what they experienced may never fully heal. The Salt Lake City neighborhood where Norland died struggled to process what had happened. Neighbors felt guilty for not recognizing the signs, for not doing more to help. But as child welfare experts point out, abuse is often invisible to outsiders. It happens behind closed doors, masked by normal family routines, hidden by parents skilled at presenting a functional facade to the outside world. Norland's death prompted renewed calls for reform of Utah's child protective system. Advocates pointed out that Child Protective Services had been aware of problems in the Flores-Rosales home but hadn't removed the children. They argued that the system prioritizes family reunification over child safety, that caseworkers are overworked and under-resourced, that children fall through the cracks because there aren't enough people paying attention. The reforms came too late for Norland. He died because the system failed him, because his mother's violence went unchecked, because the warning signs were seen but not acted upon decisively enough. His death was preventable, which makes it all the more tragic. Today, Reyna Flores-Rosales sits in prison, where she'll remain for at least 15 years. Norland is buried in a Salt Lake City cemetery, his grave marked by a small headstone that identifies him only by name and dates. His life was short, ended violently by the person who should have loved him most. His story is a reminder that motherhood doesn't guarantee love, that the title mother can be held by those who lack every maternal instinct, that children's vulnerability makes them easy victims when those charged with protecting them become predators instead. If Norland's story moved you, if you believe these victims deserve to have their stories told, hit that like button. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour, so you're here for every case we cover. These children can't speak for themselves anymore, so we speak for them. Justice for Norland. Always. Case 5, Tricia Kavanaugh, June 9, 2016, Delaware County. Tricia Kavanaugh called herself a supermom. A judge would later tell her, in front of a packed courtroom, that he was not so sure about that. On the morning of June 9, 2016, at approximately 9:17 in the morning, Muncie police were dispatched to a residence on Glenwood Avenue. The call was about an unresponsive child. When officers arrived, they found Kavanaugh kneeling on the floor next to her 4-month-old daughter. The baby was unconscious. Kavanaugh was crying hysterically and trying to perform CPR on the infant. Medics arrived and transported the child to IU Healthball Memorial Hospital. Less than an hour after police responded to that home, the baby was pronounced dead. When officers spoke to Kavanaugh at the scene, they noted she appeared to be intoxicated. Her balance was unsteady. Her speech was slow and slurred. She had poor manual dexterity. Officers also detected the smell of burnt marijuana inside the residence. Kavanaugh told police she had woken up during the night to breastfeed her daughter. She fell asleep afterward. When she woke up that morning, the baby was lying face down next to her in the adult bed. Police obtained a search warrant and had Kavanaugh's blood drawn. The results showed she had hydrocodone and nordazepam in her system. A search of her home revealed a bottle of gabapentin, 6 bottles of hydrocodone, and 1 bottle of diazepam. Records checks revealed that Kavanaugh had been prescribed hydrocodone and diazepam, but she had used significantly more of the hydrocodone than her prescription recommended. She had not received a prescription for oxycodone in the year leading up to her daughter's death, but evidence suggested she had been using it. The autopsy was unable to determine the exact cause of death. However, the doctor who performed it indicated that unsafe sleeping conditions were a contributing factor in the infant's death. This was not the first time anyone had warned Kavanaugh. In January of 2015, Child Services had investigated her after she tested positive for drugs during a previous investigation. During that investigation, Kavanaugh told officials she was really bad about co-sleeping with her children. She said she understood why it was risky. She was warned about the dangers. Explicitly. Repeatedly. A drug screening during that earlier DCS investigation revealed she had Xanax, marijuana, and cocaine in her system. Medical records from the hospital also revealed something else. When Kavanaugh's daughter was born, the baby tested positive for opiates. The infant was placed in the NICU for neonatal drug withdrawal. This mother had been using drugs while pregnant, and her baby was born dependent on those substances. And then 8 years later, that same mother took drugs, fell asleep next to that baby in an adult bed, and the baby suffocated. Kavanaugh was arrested in July of 2017 in connection with the death. She did not plead guilty until September of 2024, 8 years after her daughter died. At her sentencing hearing, she described herself as a supermom. Delaware County Judge Douglas Mahor looked at her and said, "I am not so sure about that." She was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Delaware County Prosecutor Eric Hoffman said this case was a prime example of the needless death of an infant due to unsafe sleep practices. He reminded the public, infants should always sleep alone, on their backs, in a safe crib. A mother who knew better, who was told over and over again, who continued to use drugs, who continued to co-sleep, and a baby who paid for it with her life. If you are watching this for that little girl, leave a comment. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour. Like this video. These stories need to be told. Case 6, Morgan Stapp, November 1st, 2024, Marion County. This next case is one of the most stomach-turning cases in this entire documentary. What this mother did to her own infant daughter is something that will make you physically sick. Morgan Stapp was 32 years old. She was a mother of 7 children. And on November 1st, 2024, she sent a message on Snapchat to an unidentified man that offered her 7-month-old daughter to be sexually assaulted for $400. The message included 3 photographs of her infant daughter. Snapchat flagged the message as potentially illegal and reported it directly to the FBI. 10 days later, FBI agents showed up at Stapp's home on Union Street on the near south side of Indianapolis to interview her. When agents confronted her, Stapp claimed her Snapchat account had been hacked. She said she no longer had access to it. She even said she had received an email telling her the account had been banned for online commercial sex transactions. None of it was true. Later that same month, during an interview with the Indiana Department of Child Services, Stapp admitted she had lied to the FBI. She told DCS, "I wanted the FBI to leave." Indianapolis Metropolitan Police were contacted by the FBI in December to assist with the investigation. A detective obtained a search warrant for Stapp's Snapchat account. What they found inside was appalling. During just 3 days in November, days after Stapp had spoken to the FBI and claimed she no longer had access to the account, her account had sent over 7,000 messages. 81 of those messages were identical. Each one asked the same question. "Would you be interested in buying my nudes so I can get baby diapers?" She had also added over 400 new accounts during that same period. IP address records confirmed that every single one of those messages was sent from an area near Stapp's home address. This was not a hack. This was not someone else. This was Morgan Stapp. Court documents were officially filed on July 1, 2025, charging Stapp with attempted child sexual trafficking, a Level 2 felony. A warrant was issued for her arrest. She was taken into custody on July 8 and booked into the Marion County Jail. During her initial court appearance, Stapp told the judge she was a stay-at-home mother who received government aid and did DoorDash and Instacart on the side. She noted that DCS had removed her children from her care in December of 2024 and had only just returned them to her in June of 2025, less than 2 months before her arrest. Her bond was set at $200,000. The investigation is ongoing. The charges are attempted child sexual trafficking. But the messages in that Snapchat account tell a story that goes beyond what was charged. A mother of 7, who offered her own 7-month-old infant to a stranger on the internet to be sexually assaulted for $400, and then lied to federal agents about it. This is not a case where someone snapped under pressure. This is not a case of mental illness that pushed someone over the edge in a moment of crisis. This was calculated. This was deliberate. This was a mother who looked at her baby and saw a way to make money. Hit that subscribe button. Hit like. Cold Case Hour will keep telling these stories until every single one of these children is remembered. Case 7. Heidi Marie Rutchey, the Logan mother's dark secret. Logan, Utah, nestled in the Cache Valley against the backdrop of the Wasatch Mountains, is the kind of town where everyone seems to know everyone else. It's a college town, home to Utah State University, with a mix of students, young families, and longtime residents. It's a place where people feel safe leaving their doors unlocked, where children play outside until dark, where tragedy feels like something that happens elsewhere. But on September 14, 2013, tragedy came to Logan in a way nobody expected. A 2-year-old boy, a toddler barely old enough to speak in full sentences, was found dead in his home. And his mother, Heidi Marie Rutchey, couldn't explain what had happened. The call to police came in the late afternoon. A child wasn't breathing. First responders arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. The little boy, whose name has been withheld from public records to protect his siblings, was deceased. The scene was wrong in ways the responding officers couldn't immediately articulate, but their instincts told them this wasn't a natural death or a tragic accident. Something bad had happened here. Medical examiners discovered the child had died from injuries that could only have been inflicted intentionally. There was blunt force trauma, evidence of shaking, signs that this toddler had been violently assaulted. The timeline of the injuries suggested the abuse had been ongoing, that this child had suffered for some time before his death. Heidi Rutchey's story to police was inconsistent and vague. She claimed her son had fallen, had gotten hurt while playing, had seemed fine, and then suddenly wasn't. But the medical evidence contradicted every aspect of her story. The injuries were too severe, too numerous, too specific to have resulted from normal childhood accidents. As investigators dug deeper, they learned that Child Protective Services had been involved with the Rutchey family before. There had been reports, investigations, concerns about the children's welfare. But each time, the case had been assessed and closed without removal of the children. The system had decided the kids were safe enough at home. That decision, made with limited information and competing demands on caseworkers' time, had proved tragically wrong. Neighbors told investigators they'd heard shouting from the Rutchey home, had sometimes heard children crying, but nothing that seemed urgent enough to report. In retrospect, they felt guilty for not paying closer attention, for not insisting on intervention. But as child welfare experts note, it's almost impossible for outsiders to know when normal family stress crosses the line into dangerous abuse. Heidi Rutchey was arrested and charged with murder and child abuse homicide. Prosecutors alleged she'd been abusing her 2-year-old son for an extended period, that the abuse had escalated until it proved fatal, and that she'd attempted to cover up her crime by claiming the death was accidental. The case revealed disturbing details about the Rutchey household. Heidi had been struggling with substance abuse, using methamphetamine regularly while caring for her children. Her drug use had made her paranoid, irritable, and violent. Her young children, unable to understand what was happening, had become targets of her drug-fueled rage. On the day her 2-year-old son died, Heidi had been high and angry about something minor, something that in a normal household would have resulted in a brief moment of frustration and nothing more. But in her impaired state, she'd lashed out at her toddler with deadly force. By the time she realized how badly she'd hurt him, it was too late. Rather than immediately call for help, she'd waited, perhaps hoping he'd recover on his own, perhaps trying to figure out how to explain his injuries. That delay may have cost the child any chance of survival. The trial brought Logan's attention to the often hidden problem of parental substance abuse and its impact on children. Experts testified about how methamphetamine use can make users violent and unpredictable, how it destroys the capacity for normal parental love and protectiveness, how children in homes where parents use meth are at significantly elevated risk of abuse. Heidi Rutchey's defense attorneys argued that her drug addiction had impaired her judgment, that she'd been unable to control her actions, that her crime was the product of addiction rather than intentional cruelty. But prosecutors countered that Rutchey had made choices at every step. She'd chosen to use drugs. She'd chosen to continue using while responsible for young children. She'd chosen violence over seeking help. And when her son lay dying, she'd chosen to delay calling for help, costing him his last chance at survival. The jury found Heidi Rutchey guilty of child abuse homicide. She was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, meaning she'll serve at least 15 years before being eligible for parole. Given the severity of her crime and the complete lack of remorse she displayed during trial, many observers believe she'll serve far longer. Her surviving children were removed from her custody and placed with relatives who could provide a safe, stable environment. They carry the trauma of witnessing their brother's death, of living in a home where violence and drug use were normalized, of losing both their sibling and their mother in a single terrible event. The Logan community struggled to process what had happened. This was supposed to be a safe place, somewhere families could thrive. But Heidi Rutchey's crime demonstrated that danger can lurk anywhere, that addiction and violence don't respect community boundaries, that children are vulnerable even in towns that pride themselves on being family-friendly. The case prompted renewed discussion about the opioid and methamphetamine epidemic affecting Utah and the entire country. Advocates pointed out that children are often the invisible victims of the drug crisis, suffering abuse and neglect at the hands of addicted parents, while the focus remains on the addicts themselves rather than their vulnerable dependents. Child Protective Services came under scrutiny for having been aware of problems in the Rutchey home without taking action aggressive enough to prevent tragedy. Caseworkers, already overworked and dealing with impossible caseloads, defended their decisions, noting that they'd followed protocol and made judgment calls that seemed reasonable at the time. But those judgment calls had left a 2-year-old boy in a home where he'd ultimately be killed. The boy's father, who'd been estranged from Heidi and fighting for custody, expressed anguish that he hadn't been able to save his son. He'd been trying to prove Heidi was an unfit mother, had been documenting concerns and building a case. But the legal system moved slowly, and his son had run out of time before the custody battle could be resolved. Today, Heidi Marie Rutchey remains incarcerated, serving her sentence at a Utah prison. She'll be in her 40s before she's even eligible for parole, and there's no guarantee she'll ever be released. Her son, the 2-year-old boy whose life she took, is buried in a Logan cemetery. His grave is visited regularly by family members who loved him, who grieve what he might have become if he'd been given the chance to grow up. The case serves as a stark reminder of the connection between substance abuse and child abuse, of the vulnerability of children in homes where addiction reigns, of the failures that occur when systems designed to protect kids don't act decisively enough or quickly enough. If this case made you think about the children suffering in homes affected by addiction, if you believe these stories need to be told to prevent future tragedies, hit that like button. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour and turn on notifications so you never miss when we cover cases that demand attention. These children's stories matter. Their lives mattered. Let's make sure they're never forgotten. Case 8. Carrie Marie Murray, the newest tragedy. This case is so recent that the pain is still raw, the investigation still ongoing, the community still reeling. On March 19, 2025, just weeks ago as of this recording, emergency responders in Utah were called to a home where they discovered an 18-month-old child in critical condition. The baby, Ruby Marie Murray, was rushed to the hospital, But despite aggressive medical intervention, she couldn't be saved. She died from what medical examiners would later determine was severe malnutrition and dehydration. Ruby Marie was still a baby, really. 18 months old is the age when toddlers are learning to walk confidently, starting to say simple words, exploring their world with curiosity and wonder. Ruby should have been taking her first steps, babbling her first sentences, discovering the joy of independence. Instead, she starved to death while in her mother's care. Carrie Marie Murray, Ruby's mother, was immediately arrested and charged with murder and child abuse homicide. As investigators processed the scene and gathered evidence, the full scope of the neglect became clear. Ruby hadn't died from a sudden illness or an unforeseeable medical crisis. She died from sustained, severe neglect that had gone on for weeks or possibly months. Medical examiners who performed Ruby's autopsy were shocked by what they found. The child was severely emaciated, her weight far below what it should have been for her age. She showed signs of chronic malnutrition, indicating she'd been deprived of adequate food for an extended period. She was dehydrated to a degree that suggested she hadn't had access to enough fluids. Her tiny body had essentially shut down from lack of basic nutrition and hydration. The question investigators immediately asked was, how does an 18-month-old baby starve to death in 2025 in Utah? This isn't a third-world country ravaged by famine. This isn't a community without resources. Food and water were available. The neglect that killed Ruby was a choice, not an unavoidable tragedy. As detectives investigated, they discovered that Child Protective Services had been aware of the Murray family. There had been previous reports, investigations that had been opened and closed. But as with so many of these cases, the intervention hadn't been aggressive enough or thorough enough to save Ruby. The system had assessed the risk and decided it was acceptable to leave Ruby in her mother's care. That decision, made with incomplete information and competing priorities, had cost Ruby her life. Neighbors told investigators they'd rarely seen Ruby, that Carrie Murray kept to herself and didn't allow people to visit. The isolation should have been a red flag, but without someone inside the home willing to report what was happening, there was no way for outsiders to know how bad things had gotten. The home where Ruby died was not a house of poverty. There was food in the cupboards, water in the taps. Carrie Murray wasn't someone struggling to provide basic necessities due to financial hardship. The neglect that killed Ruby wasn't about lack of resources. It was about a mother who simply didn't care for her daughter, who didn't bother to feed her adequately, who allowed her baby to slowly waste away. Prosecutors have alleged that Carrie Murray's neglect was willful and intentional, that she knew Ruby was suffering but did nothing to help. They've pointed to evidence that Murray was aware of Ruby's deteriorating condition but chose not to seek medical help, perhaps fearing that doctors would recognize the neglect and report her to authorities. The case has sparked outrage across Utah. How does a baby starve to death in the modern era? How does neglect reach this level without intervention? The questions demand answers, and the Murray case is forcing difficult conversations about child welfare, about the signs of neglect, about the responsibility of communities to protect vulnerable children. Carrie Murray's family members have spoken to media, expressing shock and claiming they had no idea Ruby was being neglected. They say Carrie had kept them at arm's length in recent months, that they'd asked to see Ruby but been given excuses. They describe feeling guilty for not pushing harder, for not insisting on seeing the baby, for trusting Carrie when they should have been more suspicious. As the legal case against Carrie Murray moves forward, prosecutors are building a comprehensive picture of the neglect that killed Ruby. They're documenting the timeline of her decline, gathering medical evidence, interviewing witnesses who can speak to Carrie's state of mind and her actions in the months before Ruby's death. Carrie Murray has pleaded not guilty to the charges, her defense attorneys arguing that Ruby's death was a tragic accident rather than intentional murder. They claim Carrie was overwhelmed and struggling with her own issues, that she didn't willfully neglect her daughter. But prosecutors are pushing back hard, arguing that a baby doesn't starve to death by accident, that the level of neglect required to kill a child through malnutrition and dehydration can only be intentional. The medical evidence will be crucial in the trial. Experts will testify about how long it takes for an 18-month-old to die from malnutrition and dehydration, about the signs Carrie should have recognized, about the numerous opportunities she had to seek help or provide care. They'll paint a picture of a baby suffering while her mother did nothing. Ruby's death has prompted calls for reform of Utah's child protective system. Advocates are asking why previous reports about the Murray family didn't result in more aggressive intervention, why caseworkers didn't follow up more thoroughly, why Ruby was left in a home where she would ultimately die. The answers are complicated, involving systemic issues like understaffing, overwhelming caseloads, and the legal difficulty of removing children from their parents without clear evidence of imminent danger. But those systemic issues don't change the fundamental fact. Ruby Marie Murray died because her mother didn't feed her. She died slowly, painfully, unnecessarily. She died while surrounded by resources that could have saved her. She died because the person responsible for her care simply didn't care. The community where Ruby lived has come together to mourn her. Strangers who never knew Ruby have left flowers and teddy bears at the location where she died. They've donated to funds set up to cover her funeral expenses. They've demanded justice and accountability. The outpouring of grief from people who never met Ruby stands in stark contrast to the indifference shown by the one person who should have loved her most. As of this recording, Carrie Murray remains in custody, awaiting trial. The case is expected to go before a jury sometime in late 2025 or early 2026. Given the strength of the evidence and the heinous nature of the crime, prosecutors are confident they'll secure a conviction. Ruby would have turned 2 years old in September 2025. She should be reaching that milestone, celebrating with family, growing and learning and experiencing the world. Instead, she's gone, her potential unrealized, her future stolen by neglect. The Carrie Murray case is the newest in this tragic series, but it won't be the last. Somewhere in Utah right now, another child is suffering. Another mother is failing in her most basic duty. Another tragedy is unfolding behind closed doors. The question is whether we'll recognize the warning signs in time, whether the systems meant to protect children will work better next time, whether Ruby's death will spark changes that prevent the next one. If this case, so recent and raw, affected you deeply, if you believe Ruby's story needs to be told so her death wasn't in vain, hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. We cover the cases that matter, the victims who deserve to be remembered, the tragedies that demand our attention. Turn on notifications and be here for every upload. Justice for Ruby. Always. Case 9. Sun-Cha Warhola. A mother's unthinkable choice. August 2006 in Murray, Utah, started as an ordinary summer day. Families were enjoying the last weeks before school started back, kids were playing outside in the heat, and life in this comfortable suburb south of Salt Lake City was following its normal rhythms. But inside one house, something terrible was unfolding, something that would leave a community devastated and searching for answers that might never come. Sun-Cha Warhola was a 46-year-old mother of 2, married, living in a middle-class neighborhood where families barbecued together and kids rode their bikes up and down the quiet streets. To neighbors, the Warholas seemed like a typical family. There were no obvious signs of dysfunction, no red flags that suggested the horror about to unfold. But on that August day, Sun-Cha Warhola took the lives of her 2 children, a 7-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son. The children, whose names have been kept private to protect their memory, died at their mother's hands in their own home, in what should have been the safest place in their world. When police arrived at the Warhola home after receiving a disturbing call, they found a scene that would haunt them for years. The 2 children were deceased, and Sun-Cha Warhola was the only possible suspect. She'd been alone with them. She'd had the means and opportunity. And as the investigation progressed, it became clear she'd had some form of motive, however incomprehensible it seemed to rational minds. The medical examiner determined the children had been smothered. It's a particularly intimate way to kill someone, requiring sustained effort and close physical contact. Unlike shooting or stabbing, which can be done at a distance, smothering requires the killer to literally hold their victim down, to watch them struggle, to feel their movements cease. That Sun-Cha Warhola could do this to her own children, not once but twice, suggested something profoundly broken in her psychology. As investigators pieced together what had happened, they looked for warning signs, for explanations, for any indication of why a mother would kill her own children. They discovered that Sun-Cha had been struggling with depression, that she'd been receiving mental health treatment, that she'd expressed feelings of hopelessness and despair. But millions of people battle depression without harming anyone, let alone their own children. Something more than standard depression had been at work here. Forensic psychologists who evaluated Nichole Warhola after her arrest found evidence of severe mental illness. She'd been experiencing delusional thinking, believing that her children would be better off dead than living in a world she perceived as dangerous and corrupt. She'd convinced herself that killing them was an act of love, that she was protecting them from future suffering. This type of thinking, while clearly the product of severe mental illness, didn't excuse what she'd done in the eyes of the law. Nichole Warhola was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The question before the court wasn't whether she'd killed her children. That was indisputable, but whether she'd been legally sane at the time of the killings. Her defense attorneys argued that she'd been in the grip of severe mental illness, that she hadn't been capable of understanding the wrongfulness of her actions, that she should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Prosecutors pushed back, arguing that while Nichole had mental health issues, she'd known what she was doing was wrong. They pointed to evidence that she'd taken steps to avoid being caught, that she'd made choices about when and how to kill her children, that she'd demonstrated the kind of planning that indicated she understood she was committing a crime. The trial was emotionally brutal. Jurors heard testimony about the children's lives, about what they'd been like, what they'd enjoyed, what they'd dreamed of becoming. Teachers described bright, engaged students who loved school and had been looking forward to the upcoming school year. Neighbors talked about sweet kids who'd play outside and wave hello. The children's father, Nichole's husband, testified about his marriage, about his wife's declining mental health, about his regrets that he hadn't recognized how serious her condition had become. He'd known she was depressed, but he'd thought she was getting treatment, thought she was improving. He'd never imagined she was capable of hurting their children. His testimony was heartbreaking, a man trying to comprehend how his entire family had been destroyed in a single day. Mental health experts testified for both sides. The defense brought in psychiatrists who explained that Nichole had been experiencing a psychotic break, that she genuinely believed she was helping her children by killing them, that her grasp on reality had been so distorted she couldn't be held criminally responsible for her actions. The prosecution's experts testified that while Nichole had mental health issues, she'd retained enough awareness of reality to understand that killing her children was wrong. They noted that she'd chosen a time when her husband was away, that she'd taken steps to ensure privacy, that she'd demonstrated the kind of planning inconsistent with complete psychosis. The jury deliberated for days, struggling with the terrible question before them. Was Nichole Warhola a murderer who deserved prison, or was she a severely mentally ill woman who belonged in a psychiatric facility? The decision would determine not just her fate, but also how society understood this tragedy. Ultimately, the jury found Nichole Warhola guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. They determined that while she'd been mentally ill, she'd been legally sane enough to understand the wrongfulness of her actions. The verdict meant she would face prison rather than psychiatric confinement. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged the complexity of the case. He noted that Nichole Warhola's mental illness had clearly played a role in the tragedy, but that didn't absolve her of responsibility for taking 2 innocent lives. He sentenced her to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, meaning she would spend at least 30 years in prison before being eligible for parole. The Murray community struggled to process what had happened. Parents looked at their own children with renewed gratitude and fear, grateful for what they had, fearful of how fragile it all was. The Warhola home, where 2 children had died, became a place people avoided, a reminder of tragedy too terrible to dwell on. Mental health advocates used the case to highlight the need for better support systems for families dealing with severe mental illness. They pointed out that Nichole Warhola had been receiving treatment, but clearly it hadn't been adequate to prevent tragedy. They called for more resources, better screening, more aggressive intervention when parents show signs of dangerous instability. But others argued that the focus on mental illness risked excusing the inexcusable. 2 children were dead because their mother killed them. Whatever her mental state, the result was the same. They were gone, and she was responsible. The case raised difficult questions about the intersection of mental illness and criminal responsibility. Where is the line between someone so ill they can't be blamed for their actions and someone whose illness may have contributed but who still made choices? How do we balance compassion for the mentally ill with justice for victims? There are no easy answers. Today, Nichole Warhola remains incarcerated in Utah, where she'll likely spend the rest of her life. She'll be in her 70s before she's even eligible for parole, and given the nature of her crimes, release seems unlikely. Her children, who would be in their 20s now if they'd lived, are buried side by side in a Murray cemetery. Their father visits regularly, leaving flowers and toys, talking to them about what might have been. The case stands as a tragic reminder that mental illness, when severe and untreated or inadequately treated, can have devastating consequences. It's also a reminder that being a mother doesn't guarantee maternal love, that the title means nothing if the instinct to protect and nurture is absent. If the Nichole Warhola case made you think about the importance of mental health awareness and intervention, if you believe these children's stories deserve to be told, hit that like button. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you're here for every case we cover. These victims can't speak for themselves anymore, so we speak for them. Don't forget to turn on notifications for every upload. Case 10. Lisa Jo Vanderlinden. When a mother kills twice. Some people commit horrible crimes once and spend the rest of their lives regretting it. Others reveal through their actions that their first crime wasn't an aberration but a reflection of who they fundamentally are. Lisa Jo Vanderlinden falls into the second category, a woman whose violence against her own children shocked even seasoned investigators who thought they'd seen everything. In December 2004, West Jordan, Utah, became the scene of a tragedy that would haunt the community for years. 15-year-old Caitlin Vanderlinden was found dead in her home, and the circumstances of her death pointed unmistakably to murder. The person responsible was the one person who should have protected her above all others, her mother, Lisa Jo Vanderlinden. Caitlin was a high school sophomore, someone who loved music and art, who had dreams of becoming a graphic designer. She was navigating the typical challenges of teenage life, school stress, friend drama, figuring out who she wanted to be. She should have had decades ahead of her to explore those questions. Instead, her life was cut short by maternal violence that defied comprehension. The investigation revealed that Lisa Vanderlinden had killed her daughter during a violent confrontation at their home. The exact details of what sparked the violence remained somewhat unclear, but the result was unambiguous. Caitlin died from injuries inflicted by her mother. Medical examiners determined the death was not accidental, not the result of a scuffle gone wrong, but the intentional taking of a life. Lisa Vanderlinden was arrested and charged with murder. As investigators looked into her background, they discovered a history of instability, of conflict with her children, of a parenting style that relied heavily on physical discipline and control. Child welfare workers had been involved with the family before, though not to a degree that resulted in removal of the children. Once again, the system had assessed the risk and deemed it acceptable to leave kids with their mother. And once again, that decision had proved fatal. At trial, prosecutors painted Lisa Vanderlinden as a woman with a violent temper, someone who saw her children as possessions to be controlled rather than individuals to be nurtured. They argued that she'd killed Caitlin in a rage, that the murder had been the culmination of years of abuse and conflict. Lisa's defense attorneys attempted to argue that she'd been acting in self-defense, that Caitlin had attacked her, and she'd merely defended herself. But the medical evidence contradicted this narrative. Caitlin's injuries indicated she'd been the victim, not the aggressor. She'd been a 15-year-old girl killed by her adult mother. The jury found Lisa Vanderlinden guilty of murder. She was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, meaning she'd serve at least 15 years before being eligible for parole. The West Jordan community breathed a sigh of relief that justice had been served, that Caitlin's killer had been held accountable. But the story didn't end there. Years later, in a development that shocked everyone familiar with the case, Lisa Vanderlinden was charged with another murder, the death of her infant son decades earlier. Investigators had reopened cold cases involving suspicious child deaths, and advanced forensic techniques had revealed evidence that Lisa's infant son hadn't died of natural causes as originally believed. He'd been killed, and Lisa was the only possible suspect. The revelation that Lisa Vanderlinden had likely killed two of her children, years apart, transformed the narrative around her crimes. She wasn't a woman who'd made one terrible mistake in a moment of rage. She was someone with a pattern of violence against her own children, Someone who'd killed before and been able to hide it, who'd killed again years later. Prosecutors in the infant's death argued that Lisa had smothered her baby boy, then claimed he'd died of sudden infant death syndrome. At the time, in an era before modern forensic techniques, her story had been accepted. But new technology allowed investigators to detect evidence that had been missed initially. The baby had been murdered, and Lisa had gotten away with it for decades. The legal proceedings around the infant's death were complicated by the passage of time. Evidence had been lost, witnesses' memories had faded, and Lisa's attorneys argued that she couldn't get a fair trial for a crime committed so long ago. But prosecutors were determined to get justice for the baby who'd been murdered and forgotten. Lisa Vanderlinden was ultimately convicted of the infant's death as well, though the legal complexities meant the sentence was less severe than it might have been had the crime been discovered sooner. She received an additional sentence to be served concurrently with her existing sentence for Caitlin's murder. The revelation that Lisa had killed 2 of her children raised terrible questions. Had there been warning signs that were missed with the first death? Could Caitlin's murder have been prevented if investigators had been more suspicious about the infant's death years earlier? The answers were unknowable, but the questions haunted everyone who'd been involved with the family. Lisa's surviving children, who'd grown up believing their infant brother had died of natural causes, had to confront the horrifying reality that their mother had killed him. They'd already lost their sister to their mother's violence. Now they learned they'd lost a brother too. The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating. Child welfare experts studied the Vanderlinden case, looking for lessons that could prevent future tragedies. They noted that Lisa had been able to hide her violence for years, that she'd presented a functional facade to the outside world while committing murders behind closed doors. They emphasized the importance of thorough investigation of any child death, of maintaining suspicion even when explanations seem plausible, of understanding that some parents are capable of the unthinkable. The case also highlighted the limitations of the justice system. Lisa had killed an infant and gotten away with it for decades. If she hadn't killed again, she might never have been caught. How many other cold cases involve parents who killed their children and were never held accountable? The question is sobering and ultimately unanswerable. Today, Lisa Jo Vanderlinden remains in prison, where she'll likely spend the rest of her life. She's denied requests for interviews, refused to discuss her crimes, shown no apparent remorse for the 2 children she killed. Her silence on the subject is perhaps fitting. What could she possibly say that would make sense of what she did? Caitlin would have been in her 30s now if she'd lived. She might have pursued her dream of graphic design, might have built a career and a family, might have been living a full and happy life. Instead, she was murdered at 15 by the woman who'd given her life. The infant's son who died decades earlier never got a chance to be anything. He existed for only a few months before his mother took his life. He has no grave marker with his name, no memorial, no justice beyond the late conviction of his killer. He exists now only as a case number, a cold case solved too late to matter much to anyone, but his siblings who mourn the brother they never really knew. The Lisa Vanderlinden case is a chilling reminder that some people are capable of repeated violence, that killing once can make it easier to kill again, that maternal instinct is not universal. It's also a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes, even decades later, the truth emerges and accountability follows. If this final case in our series left you contemplating the depths of human evil and the importance of never giving up on justice, show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to Cold Case Hour. We've covered 10 cases today, 10 mothers whose crimes shattered lives and communities. These stories need to be told. These victims need to be remembered. And your support helps us continue this crucial work. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us next time as we continue to shine light into the darkest corners of human behavior. Conclusion: understanding the unthinkable. We've journeyed through 10 cases today, 10 stories of maternal betrayal that challenge everything we think we know about motherhood, about family, about the bonds that should be sacred and unbreakable. From Megan Huntsman's House of Horrors in Pleasant Grove to Lisa Vanderlinden's decades-spanning violence in West Jordan, from Ruby Franke's torture masked as discipline to Carrie Murray's fatal neglect, we've seen the worst of what humans are capable of. These cases aren't easy to hear. They disturb us, challenge us, force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. but they're important. These children deserve to have their stories told. These crimes need to be examined, understood, and remembered so that perhaps, just perhaps, we can prevent the next one. What links these 10 cases? What transforms a mother from protector to predator? The answers are complex and varied. Mental illness played a role in some cases. Substance abuse contributed to others. Religious extremism, sadistic personality traits, simple evil, all were factors in different crimes. But perhaps the most chilling commonality is this. In almost every case, there were warning signs that were missed or ignored. Child protective services had been involved but hadn't removed children from dangerous homes. Teachers had noticed bruises but accepted explanations. Neighbors had heard things that concerned them but didn't report. The system meant to protect vulnerable children failed repeatedly, with fatal consequences. This doesn't mean the system or the people working within it are evil or incompetent. Child protective workers are overwhelmed, underfunded, dealing with impossible caseloads and making life or death decisions with incomplete information. Teachers see bruises but know that removing children from their parents is a traumatic intervention that should only happen when absolutely necessary. Neighbors don't want to interfere in other families' business or make accusations that might be unfounded. But the result of all this well-intentioned caution is that children suffer and die. The balance between respecting family privacy and protecting vulnerable children is extraordinarily difficult to strike. These 10 cases represent 10 times that balance tipped the wrong way, with tragic results. Utah, like many states, has tried to learn from these tragedies. Child welfare laws have been strengthened. Training for caseworkers has been enhanced. Public awareness campaigns encourage people to report suspected abuse. Mandatory reporting requirements for teachers, doctors, and other professionals who work with children have been expanded. But laws and policies can only do so much. Ultimately, protecting children requires a cultural shift, a willingness to look beyond normal family privacy when something seems wrong, an understanding that intervening in suspected abuse isn't interfering, but rather fulfilling a moral obligation. These 10 mothers, Megan Huntsman, Ruby Franke, Nicole Scott, Reyna Flores-Rosales, Ashlee Buzzard, Nicole Lester, Heidi Rutchey, Carrie Murray, Sun Cha Warhola, and Lisa Vanderlinden, are serving or will serve lengthy prison sentences for their crimes. Justice, in a legal sense, has been or will be served. But justice for their victims is impossible. You can't unjustify a life taken, can't undo the suffering of a child who died in terror and pain at their mother's hands. What we can do is remember. We can tell these stories, speak these children's names when permitted, ensure that their brief lives mattered, that their deaths weren't in vain. We can use these tragedies to inform policy, to train child welfare workers, to educate the public about warning signs of abuse. We can refuse to look away from the uncomfortable truth that evil exists, sometimes in the last place we'd expect to find it. The most evil mothers in Utah weren't monsters from horror movies. They were real women living in real communities, raising children in normal-looking homes. They could be anyone's neighbor, anyone's family member. And that's perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all. Evil doesn't announce itself. It hides behind ordinary facades, wears the mask of normalcy, operates in the shadows until it's too late. If you've stayed with us through all 10 cases, thank you. These aren't easy stories to hear, and your willingness to listen, to care, to remember these victims means everything. Hit that like button if this documentary affected you. Subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you're here for every case we cover. Turn on notifications so you never miss when we shine light on stories that need to be told.